On today's episode, we're going to talk about 3 ways to help you embed the new view of safety into your organization. And there's a lot to talk about, so I think we should get right to it.
Sounds good.
When trying to embed new view safety into your organization, there's a couple things we can do. Let's talk about moving away from old view. And to do that, we should probably define old view. Let's make sure we all have the same mental model.
Sure.
I'll let you do that. That's your bailiwick. I don't even know if that's the right word, but it sounds right. So
You know what? We'll go with it.
Yeah. Bailiwick.
I think when we start thinking about like what old view is, there's so much there. First thing we don't want to present is it's just this easy snap of the fingers. Hey, just click the button that says turn off old view, right? But with that being said, we can talk about some key features that we would say really line up with that old view thinking, and certainly some strategies that would allow us to go move away from that, really. So when I think about old view, some of the key features that are typically going to be, I would say, embedded there. First one is going to be blame, right? This can be standing out in language that you have as an organization. This could be embedded into the learning processes of an organization. That could be something like CQI. It could be a review. I mean, you could even talk about this in terms of like a performance evaluation as well. But when you just have conversation first, that starts out with thinking that a person is a problem, right? That's going to be very much old view. You want to move away from that, right? Yeah. How do we get better information? When you have learning approaches that stop at human error, right? You figure out somebody didn't do what they were supposed to. And then that's the furthest you ever get, right? Which then leads you to approaches of, well, let's tell them that they should have done this, or let's remind them about the policy they were supposed to follow.
Yeah.
Or
focuses our energy on fixing the person.
Reprimand them, right? Yeah. I think that those are some of the key features, is that we think about work as going wrong because people aren't just doing their job. We think about improvement efforts in our organization as just being able to kind of layer more into the system, add in more compliance, add in more rules. And a lot of that comes from, and this is connected to blame as well, is we see our organization operating as more of a component parts, right? We don't talk about the systemic nature of how our systems are actually functioning every single day.
Yeah. So let's pick a couple ways, maybe 3 ways that we can do that. Like organizations can do that, can purposefully, intentionally move away from old view.
Yeah. So the first one is definitely going to be, we need to abandon this blaming approach that we see happen within organizations. I brought this up earlier, but the first one is going to be, how do we try to move away from conversations that happen within our organization that are centering around the person-specific problem, and then ultimately leading towards ways of improvement that just address people. So that's going to be first. The next would be, how do we try to, I would say, expand on our approaches of learning within our organizations, right? We all have CQI efforts. We have, review processes for when things go wrong. We have, discussions that take place of how to support people for better performance. And so it would be, okay, well, how do we embed better techniques for conversation into those processes that get you more of that second story, get you better information about the system and the context that people have to work in every single day, so you can make improvement off that.
Yeah, and that second one of like getting the second story is going to lead, which I think you're going to go to the third one of moving away from those quick fixes, because if you don't have the second story. I have a fourth one, but you go.
Okay, I'll finish mine.
I was thinking about a fourth one, so yeah.
So we need to abandon the quick fixes. And this is inevitably connected to what I've already talked about in some sense, because when we have a simplified understanding of what the problem is, that ultimately leads us to more simplified fixes that we put together in our organization. So you really need to avoid kind of these Band-Aid fixes that we can put on within our organization, right? We add more policy, we add in, training, or we add in a subsection to policy, comes more procedures, we retrain people, checklists, laws.
We don't hate
memos.
Checklist. We don't hate all memos. We don't hate all trainings. It's just sometimes we do too much of it.
Yeah, we train a lot of people, right? So people need to be supported to have knowledge that we want them to have. Certainly people need guidance on their work as well. It's just moving away from
Just
so the
constantly
idea
doing
is,
that.
is those are the only ways that we can approach safety within our organization.
Yeah, you see that a lot in almost every performance improvement plan. You'll see there's something about resending out a policy, retraining, or something like that.
Sure.
All right, I'm going to give the fourth one. The fourth, and it's not just like there's not only four, but these are the ones we're talking about. So in sort of the old view of safety, we see things as accountability up only. Like people are accountable to meet performance standards and metrics. In the new view, and how to do this is think about how do we have a responsibility down to the people doing the work to provide the skills, tools, technology, and support so that they can meet those metrics. If we expect people to perform a certain way and complete certain tasks, then we need to ensure that we have the proper environment and setup so that they can. And when they're not, let's not immediately default to, well, the person just can't do it.
Yeah, and I think really important to connect to what you just said and some of the other pieces that we brought up earlier, that not only do we get to a place where these aren't really helpful for us practically,
right,
but they're really not good for the culture of the organization as well. When people feel like, I'm being asked to meet metrics or meet expectations, and there's no chance that I could possibly be successful with those. I don't have the tools. I don't have the time. There's no way I could get this accomplished, right?
Yeah, and without getting too deep into a story, as we sort of wrap this segment up, you and I, recently were talking with an administrator who was really lamenting about exactly what we're talking about in terms of the expectation as that, and that their staff would be able to make, I think it was something like 100 and some odd visits a month, and fill out like an incredible amount of paperwork, and then they would be sanctioned if they didn't meet the metric. It's almost impossible to do that.
Yeah, because it's, hey, let's set you up with a task that's nearly impossible for you to actually accomplish. And then what happens is there's probably a whole bunch of other work they have to do on top of that as well. And you're thinking, well, how can anybody be successful with this? And then on top of it, you're going to punch people for not being able to do this?
Yeah, there's better ways to do it. It's not to say that, just stop counting things or just stop meeting metrics. We're not saying that at all. What we're saying is if people are having difficulty, we need to look beyond just the person.
Exactly. So let's talk about another way that organizations can try to embed New View into their organizations. Scott, I'll kick it to you for this one.
Sure. Well, one of the things that we can do is we can make sure that we build artifacts within the organization that represent the new view. So let's dive into what we mean by artifacts.
Yeah.
Structural artifacts. Some of these exist, some need to be built. And I'll get into the reason why we need to do that. Well, first, a structural artifact would be something like a systemic review process, a CQI process, a performance review process. For some of our child welfare agencies, they use a thing, they call these things child stat. There's a number of different agencies across the country that use some form of that. This is a high profile sort of event that the agency is exposed to. So those things that people come into contact with, people in the organization. And when those structures, so your CQI process, your review processes, your stats, reflect the new view, it's really important because people need to come in, within the organization, need to come into contact with the new view. It's not enough to just say, hey, we're going to be behaving differently. We're going to, we've engaged collaborative safety and, we think those guys are great. Scott may be better than Noel. No, I'm just kidding. But
we always hear that.
Sure. The whole team, right? Yeah. So, but it's not enough just to say, hey, we're doing this. We want to do this. People actually have to come into contact with things in their environment that reinforce, like, yes, we are doing things differently. So, for example, a really key example would be if there is a high profile event or a critical incident, that the way that that's done, the language that's used, the lack of sort of blaming and really looking for that second story and that those deeper analyses is going to speak to we are doing things differently.
Yeah, and I think it's important because with a lot of organizations that we can encounter, you have good intentions when you think about this from a leadership perspective, from an organizational perspective. Most people can identify with this idea that we want to learn better as an organization, that we don't want to scapegoat staff or certainly alienate people who may be involved in certain events. But what they don't realize is that it's not only just your words, it's those artifacts that you're bringing up, and like you talked about, that people come into contact. And so while you may not champion the idea of people feeling like they're blamed. While you may not want to simplify the problems in your organization, you have these artifacts and these approaches to learning that are doing just that.
That's right.
And so I always like to bring up that it's not kind of these mean people who work within organizations or who conduct investigations who just want to blame staff. A lot of times the approaches we have, they bring us to that point and they don't allow us to explore further within our organizations. And so it's really kind of identifying, okay, well, what are these structures within our organization, right? Which ones is certainly, thinking about which ones do people come into contact a lot with and saying, okay, well, what do we need to change here? And I think one of the best ways you can get information is talking to staff and listening to staff about how they experience those things. Because I think we've had conversations with staff I feel like in nearly every state. And they're open about the fact of the way they feel when they're engaged in these processes doesn't feel good.
We hear similar terms for it.
You can hear terms like, well, I feel like when I'm going to this review process, I'm walking in front of the firing squad. I feel like when I'm in part of this review, the bullseye's on me specifically.
Or we get these "you suck" emails once a month.
and when these are the terms that staff are using, well, one is it's not having a good effect on your organization, but also it's just a clear sign that you're leaving a whole bunch of information on the table that would be really useful for you to make improvement and understand what's going on in your organization.
Of course. And when we do this, and when you tie these things together, you start to and treat people differently and have better outcomes. You have better engagement, you have better retention. I mean, that's critical.
I love touching on those 2 points because it's yes, when you start bringing in kind of these new view approaches, right? You're getting that second story, right? You're getting the voice of staff, right? One is clearly you're gonna get better information to make improvements off of, and if it's a better experience for them.
Yeah, that has profound effects.
Yeah, because we hear it all the time, but it's important to talk about here that when people move away from feeling isolated after an event to feeling like they have a voice and they have a stake in the improvement of the organization, I mean, that is a strong shift, not only in the participation for a review process, but how that staff feels walking into work every single day.
And that's consistent. And to wrap this up, what you just said is consistent no matter what agency we're working with. And sometimes we talk about the different agencies, whether we're in a jail, whether we're in a psychiatric facility, in a child welfare agency. The list could go on and on and on. It doesn't matter. That is so consistent across the board and at almost every level.
Yeah. Another way that we can try to embed new view into our organization is through our language. When we talk about large organizations, this is certainly not easy, but there's a few ways that we see this embedded or reflected in the organizations we work with as they start kind of championing this new view.
For sure.
So one of the first places we see it is in everyday conversation. So
email, speaking, video conference, sure.
Right, yes, sir. When we get to a point where people are trying to understand, they talk about their work and they talk about the system they have to operate within, it's good to start shifting those conversations towards talking more about that second story, right? It moves away from, someone struggling, we can't meet metrics, problems seem insurmountable, to a place of saying, okay, well, here's what the problems actually are. Here's where they exist. Here's how it's impacting our ability to ultimately be successful within our organization. So you see the conversation of kind of what the issues are within the organization start to change, start to expand more to the context of work, more of the system that people operate within every single day. And ideally what we want to see is that find its way into supervision. Certainly, when we think about supervision, a lot of times what we can see it drift towards is more organizational risk management as opposed to trying to support somebody for success, and not because supervisors don't want to be supporting their staff. In fact, that's exactly what they want to do, but they feel they don't have the time, resources, or support to actually
their meeting culture, lots of documentation, things like that.
Right. And my gosh, I mean, the time is limited when you have these conversations. So it's saying, okay, well, how do we start moving them in a better direction? When we think about it in a new view context. One would be those conversations move away from centering around kind of person problems. You could see this being connected to blame possibly, right? When you have staff who's coming to you, they're saying that they're struggling, or you need to have a tough conversation with them about certain expectations that are there that aren't being met.
Yeah.
Well, you don't just say, okay, well, here's what the problem is. Let's talk about, what you did wrong and what you're going to do differently, right? It's all about, that person, right? Well, I wasn't paying enough attention. I didn't put enough focus in on the work. Next time I'm going to put more focus in. Next time I'm going to try harder.
Pay more
right?
attention.
Yeah. And so those conversations start to expand out. They start to talk more about the difficulties, those influences, and the context of work that ultimately play a role in someone's ability to get the job done.
Yeah. As you're saying, and I, to add to that, when I think about sort of the language that we use and saying, so starting to embed some of this new view language or paying attention to our language, it's about both what we say and don't say. So things like our facial expressions, our body postures, how inviting we are. Yeah, I feel like I need to sit up straighter when I say that. Our invitingness, I'll make up a word, how inviting it feels when I'm talking to you. So if I'm asking you questions and I'm saying the right things, but my facial expressions and body posture seem annoyed or disinterested or dismissive, that's not going to create a good culture for good communication. So it's everything from, what we don't say and how we present to some of the things that we say and how we ask questions and how we listen and how we try to move away from seeing somebody's issue just as a complaint. I know it's hard to do sometimes because I think there's some agreement we could get every now, on somebody. I think you could get agreement like, okay, I feel like this person complains a lot. But if we move away from just saying like, well, it's a complaint and say, okay, there's some substance, there needs to be some substance there, or what is there that is going to be useful? Yeah. Because chances are if that person is struggling with some particular aspect, they're not the only one.
Yeah. And I think key to this is really taking it seriously. This is real. This does have an impact on people's work. We do need to try and act on this in some way. And what's interesting is you're not always going to find yourself in a position. Let's say if you're a supervisor, you're a leader, or even if you're just somebody who's part of the conversation, you're not always going to find yourself in a position of when you're talking about these issues that you're going to immediately be able to solve them, right. or even if not even immediately,
some of
or
them
that
aren't solvable,
or that there's even like some type of way to solve them.
Yeah.
So when we get to that place, we have to recognize that may be a place that we end up. But also on the other end is there's good coming from that as well, because at the very least, you're listening to your staff. You're hearing their voice and you're taking it seriously, and you can be open about the fact of, some things are out of your control. Do we want to bring them up to a level where we can address them? 100%. But at the very least, we're starting from a place of you're taking me seriously, you're listening to my voice, and I'm getting to talk about these things that affect my everyday work.
Yeah, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Every time you say that, it just echoes of conversations we've had with hundreds of workers across the country in various industries that echo that.
Yeah, and I think that this also plays into talking about public communications, especially when things go wrong.
Oh yeah,
I'll kick it to you because you have a really good lens on this because I think you lived this a lot, and so I think you have a good lens to kind of talk about this. So I'll kick it to you on that one.
So one of the things I would say is when we communicate with the public, I've always believed we can't control what the media says, but we can control what we say and how we talk about issues. So one is to the extent that we can be transparent and open, right? That generally is the best way to go. Yeah. Sometimes there's things we can't disclose, of course, because of state statute or local ordinance or federal statute.
Right, yeah.
But the more we can be transparent and the more we can use language that is reflective of this new view of safety, and in a lot of our trainings we go into like specific words, like moving away from certain words like mistake and failure and all those other things. I won't go into those now. But the more we can, or in how we talk about what if there's a high profile event, is going to oftentimes influence the types of questions that we get. So for example, if we use counterfactual language like we should have done this, right? That counterfactual language that we want to
see
move
a lot.
away from. Yeah.
See a lot of.
So that, of course, reeks of hindsight bias, and what we call a counterfactual, it becomes very distracting. It comes with this assumption that if you did it, you'd have a better outcome and all this other stuff. But that also can lead to questions, well, who should have and what are you going to do to them? Yeah. So the types of language that we use when we're communicating externally can influence the types of questions you get. But go ahead.
I was going to say, well, it just reminded me, I was just laughing to myself because a lot of times you see it play out, publicly, but also in our own experience of, you have leadership who says, well, the media's out there to kind of blame us and say what the problem is and they're saying, well, on the front page of the paper, it's talking about what staff didn't do in this instance. And it's, well, okay, well, what information do you provide them about what happened during this event? Well, the staff didn't do the work that they were supposed to. So it's, well, you provided them a bit with this narrative. Right?
Such a solid point. Had a conversation with a leader today, a Health and Human Services leader today, about that, where so often the focus is on what people didn't do. Well, what are all the things that you did do? Well, there's a lot that agencies do, and what do we talk about? So I guess the last point I would make on this is you've experienced this with me. In fact, you were there for this story. It was a child welfare leader, large organization, and shared a story where a staff member had stopped them and said, hey, commissioner, director, secretary, we'll just use director as a sort of the highest title for this organization. And I just wanted you to know, I saw what you said in the paper and thank you for not throwing us under the bus. So I'm sort of paraphrasing, but it represented how powerful that is, because it tells you staff are listening.
They are.
This was not a small agency and it's not a small town. So
exactly. Thanks for joining us on the New View video podcast. If you want to learn more, go to collaborative-safety.com, visit us on social media. And if you like this video, go ahead and hit subscribe so you can have access to our future videos.